Pre-rendering best practices for SEO. So before we can talk about pre-rendering, we've got to talk about rendering in general, and that's like 50% of my presentation. So web page rendering, essentially this is the definition I came up with. Web rendering is a process of a server and client working together to construct or build a web page when a user makes a browser request. So as soon as you click a link or you hit a button, there's a whole series of things that happen, and this is quite a simple diagram of that. And essentially what you end up with is a web page. So there's a few things that we need to consider when building or designing a website. The first thing is speed, interactivity, cacheability, user experience, and I would say most importantly, crawlability. However, Core Web Vitals might change that a little bit. So, client versus server-side rendering. So, if you have a website, you're using a browser, you're trying to view that website from a browser, the website has to come from there, and most of the time, or all of the time, it comes from a web server, and how much of that website is built on the server and how much of that website is built on your browser depends on how you structure your website and how you design your architecture. So according to Google, as in their developer docs website, there's 5 main types of rendering, and they vary between client and server side. So the first thing is full server-side rendering. So that's if you have flat HTML, CSS, the server just sends it to the browser and the browser loads it, done. And usually you don't have any JavaScript, you wouldn't have any JavaScript. And if you have, this is Core Web Vitals here, so the time to interactive usually equals the first contentful paint because there's nothing to load after it arrives in your browser. The next is static server-side rendering. So essentially the website is rendered on the server. The JavaScript is, so let's say if you have a JavaScript app, it's rendered on the server. The JavaScript is then removed and sent to the browser. So similar to the flat HTML and CSS, except we've got the JavaScript added in on the server side, but not on the client side. Next, server-side rendering with rehydration. So this is, you could also call this hydration or hybrid rendering. So essentially the server will pre-render the pages initially and send it to the web browser or the bot. The website, you'll get a full nice looking website, but you can't really click around, you can't scroll, you can't really do anything until the full app loads behind the scenes. And you can see here, the time to interactive is a lot greater than the first contentful paint. So you get the first pre-rendered version of the website, but you can't do anything until, you can't interact with it until it loads properly. And usually you get a slower time to first byte there. Next, client-side rendering with HTML pre-rendering. So essentially what this does is similar to the last ones, but this is more on the client side. So half of it's done on the client side, half of it's done on the server side essentially, or partial. So the server will preload the website into a flat HTML file, send that to either the bots or the browser, and then the rest of the website will continue to load. So you can interact with it, but maybe like sliders won't work yet, or checkboxes won't be checked, things like that. And the time to interactive here is not as bad as the rehydration, and the TTFB is a lot faster, which is good. Then we have full client-side rendering. So the server basically just sends the scripts and styles, and everything is built in the browser. And that's usually the worst for SEO. And as I said here as well, it's not really client or server side. It's a mixture of all depending on your architecture. So today we're going to be talking about mostly pre-rendering because I could talk for hours on all of this and we don't have that time. So we've got to work out, why is this important, especially from an SEO perspective. So search engines such as Google are putting more and more focus on user experience. So if you have a poor user experience, the time to interactive is not very good. It takes ages to see the first contentful paint. Then we're not going to rank as well, or it's going to take a lot longer to rank, and we can go from there. So a few questions you've got to ask yourself is, how quickly does a web page load? And notice how I say web page, not website. Some pages could be, you could have, even in a full website, you could have half the pages loading in different types of client or server-side rendering. So how easy, stable is the web page? How easy is it to use? And can search engines see the web page, content, and links? So I'll just go back. This is the recap from my second slide. One of the most important things of considering your architecture design match up with the questions you have to ask yourself. So let's focus on crawlability. So it's known since, I think, around 2010, the Googlebot is able to render JavaScript when indexing a web page. However, search engines, they don't really have the resources all the time to be able to render your website using JavaScript. So it really becomes necessary to have a page that, or have the content and links available for a search engine to essentially see. If you don't do this right, you can have huge impact on your JavaScript, as we all see all the time. So essentially, if you're using the full client-side rendering, this is what your website looks with JavaScript enabled, and this is what your website looks like with JavaScript disabled. Even if you use different types, go a bit closer to the server side, it might not be completely blank. You might have some elements. That's okay, as long as you see the content and your links. It's okay. If the other things can load later, that's fine. So this is a graph from Google's developer portal. And we can see here, and they've publicly stated many times, that they don't always have the resources available to render your website using JavaScript. And often they build like a first index and just build out the links and work out what content you have before they'll start bringing in more resources to render the content there. Can everyone see that? Got that? So what can we do about it? Well, the first thing is go full server side. Don't have any JavaScript. Keep it simple, and you probably won't have any problems. Option 2, you can go for more of a hybrid. So you can have your content and links loading with JavaScript disabled, and then if you do have JavaScript available in your browser, you can render in all the other things later, which are like more personable things for a user to see. And then the last one, which I guess is good from a point of view if you've spent all this money, all this time building out a big website, and you didn't really design it properly from the start, you can go back through and use some form of pre-rendering, whether it's dynamic pre-rendering or isometric pre-rendering, which I won't really touch on at this time, but look it up if you're interested. So let's get into a few tips that I've got for pre-rendering. So the first thing is you could use like a third-party service to help you. Let's say you've got your app, and with JavaScript disabled, it's blank. You can use a service like this, which will crawl your website with rendering on, build a HTML index of it, and then you can use their service to serve bots or even users a basically HTML version of your website. So you can check out those services. I think the most popular one is Prerendering.io. Second tip, so you might ask, well, Google's pretty heavy on cloaking. If you're trying to cloak the search engine and give all these keyword stuffed content to bots, but then show nice content to your users, they're going to hit you pretty heavy with a manual action. So Google essentially has an exception for this rule. If your content is similar enough, and that's the wording they use, similar enough, to the rendered version, then it's okay and you shouldn't expect a manual action. The next tip is make sure that if you do serve bots this pre-rendered HTML, make sure to include not only just Googlebot, include all of the search engines, include even include LinkedIn bot. You know, go and build a big list of all of those and get all of them to see that stuff. Fourth tip, Search Console is great for this. So they've got a fetch and render thing, a fetch and render tool. So you can see if your URLs are being indexed or able to be indexed with the both with JavaScript disabled and enabled, which is great. And as Dejan was talking about just before, server log analysis can really help with finding any indexability issues with this. So if they're getting stuck on a certain part of the website that has JavaScript disabled and you might not even know, or is not being able to render, that's really good for finding that. You can set where the roadblock is and get it fixed. That is it. Thank you.